St. Giles, London, a cellar at midnight, October 1751. Mary Hatton steps down into a gin shop that smells of vinegar, vomit and turpentine. She is 28 years old. She is carrying her 2-year-old daughter. The sign above the door reads, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, clean straw for nothing." Mary puts a single copper coin on the counter. The drink in her cup is not gin, not in any way you would understand the word. It is grain spirit cut with turpentine and a few drops of oil of vitriol for the burn. The Gin Act passed Parliament 4 months ago. It has not stopped anything. In the cellars of St. Giles tonight, Londoners are drinking liquid closer to industrial poison than to anything we would call alcohol. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why the British state engineered cheap gin into existence and why it spent 22 years trying to kill what it had built. And you'll understand exactly why you wouldn't have survived the year a city drank itself to death. To understand St. Giles, you have to go back 60 years. In 1690, England was at war with France. The 9 Years' War had emptied the treasury, and the country was drinking French brandy faster than the navy could intercept it. King William III had a problem. He needed revenue, he needed to weaken French exports, and he needed to keep his Protestant nobles drinking, preferably with something English. In 1690, Parliament passed a law called an Act for Encouraging the Distilling of Brandy and Spirits from Corn. It changed England forever. The Act broke the monopoly of the Worshipful Company of Distillers, the guild that had controlled distillation in London for half a century. Under the new law, any English subject, anywhere, with no license and no training, could set up a still and turn surplus English grain into spirit. The corn was already there. English harvests had been growing for decades. The political will was already there. France was the enemy. The infrastructure followed within a generation. The price collapsed. Gin was cheaper than beer by the early 1700s, with twice the alcohol content. Within a generation, the cheapest way to consume 1,000 calories of alcohol in London was a glass of homemade gin from a backroom still. Compare this to beer. A beer housekeeper had to apply to the local magistrates for a license, pay an annual fee, swear an oath, and provide food and lodging to travelers. A gin retailer needed none of this. A man could open a gin shop in the cellar of his own house the same morning he decided to start selling. By 1729, London was distilling 3 million gallons of gin a year. By 1735, 11 million. The British state did not stumble into the gin craze. It legislated it into existence. By 1736, London was drinking on a scale that the parish surveyors could not measure. That year, the Westminster Justices of the Peace tried. They walked the streets of 95 metropolitan parishes and counted every place where gin was sold. The figure they returned was 7,044. 7,044 gin retailers in a single city. Across some parishes, the saturation was almost incalculable. St. Giles in the Fields alone, Mary Hatton's parish, recorded 506 gin shops. The parish had roughly 2,000 houses. More than one building in 4 was selling gin. It was worse in the narrow streets, Drury Lane, Seven Dials, Bedfordbury, Field Lane, streets where a man could walk 50 yards and pass 8 separate gin sellers, most of them women, most of them poor, many selling out of their own front rooms. The bills of mortality showed what gin was doing to the city. Between 1700 and 1750, London buried more people than it baptized in the majority of years. In the worst gin parishes, infant burials reached levels England had not seen for generations. 18th century writers had a word for it. They called it epidemical, not a metaphor, a description. Daniel Defour wrote in the 1720s of the abuse of that nauseous liquor amongst our lower sort, and predicted that within a generation England would have to choose between gin and its own poor. He was not the only one warning. The Society for the Reformation of Manners published pamphlets. The City of London sent petitions. Parish overseers tracked paupers and causes of death. The choice was still being deferred, because no one yet, in 1736, in 1745, in the cellar where Mary Hatton raised her glass in 1751, had asked the harder question: what exactly was in the bottle? What was in the bottle was almost never gin. Real gin, Dutch Geneva, was juniper-flavored grain spirit, distilled twice, sold by guild merchants. The gin in Mary's cup cost a penny. Producing it for that price required ingredients real gin did not contain. In the backroom stills of London, the most common substitute for juniper was turpentine. It was the right color. It cost almost nothing. It was also a pine resin solvent that could blister the human tongue. For the burn, distillers added oil of vitriol, sulfuric acid. A few drops in a barrel gave the gin what period accounts called bite. It also dissolved the lining of the stomach. The brand names told the customer what they were buying. Ladies' Delight, Cuckold's Comfort, My Lady's Eye Water, Strip Me Naked, Knock Me Down. Names painted on broadside signs across the metropolitan parishes. The sign above Mary's door, the one promising drunk for a penny, was not advertising. It was a tariff. A penny bought you intoxication, twopence bought unconsciousness. The straw was where the keeper laid the bodies while they slept it off. Some of them did not wake up. The effects of consuming this liquid daily were catalogued by Georgian physicians without yet having the chemistry to name them. There was the blindness from methanol, the bloating they called dropsy, fluid pooling in the abdomen as the liver failed, the broken capillaries that gave drinkers the red-mapped face called gin blossoms, the seizures, the night sweats, the hallucinations the physicians called gin madness, what modern medicine calls delirium tremens, and then the deaths. Inhaling their own vomit in the night, falling into open fires, walking into the Thames. In one Old Bailey-era account, a man was found dead in the straw of a Holborn gin cellar, and the keeper charged the next customer a halfpenny to step over the body. And in October 1751, Mary Hatton was still drinking. Mary Hatton is 28 years old. She is a seamstress. Her husband, Thomas, died of typhus in the summer of 1749. He was a journeyman cabinet maker on Long Acre and brought home 8 shillings a week when there was work. After he died, the rent stayed the same. The bread price rose. Mary now does fine stitch finishing on bodices for the wholesalers who supply the West End mercers. The work is 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, by candlelight in winter. She is paid by the piece. In a good week, she earns 1 shilling and 8 pence. The rent for her single room on the 3rd floor of a tenement off Drury Lane is 4pence a week. Bread for herself and her 2-year-old daughter Anne is 2pence a day. A single tallow candle is a halfpenny, and she needs 3 a week. Coal for the grate, when she can afford it, is a shilling a hundredweight. There is no margin. A glass of gin at the Cellar shop on her own street is 1 penny. It is more nutritious than the water from the public pump, which gives her dysentery in summer. It suppresses the hunger when there is no bread left at the end of the day. It dulls the cold in a room with no fire, and it lets her sleep when Anne is crying and the rats are in the wainscot. In 1751, period writers had a new name for the women like Mary, who had become regular drinkers in London's gin shops. They called gin "mother's ruin." The phrase was not metaphorical. It described with brutal precision what the British state had built and what it had not yet decided to demolish. Mary Hatton was one of tens of thousands of women in London paying its tariff. Stop the video for a moment. If your only escape from cold, hunger, and a 14-hour workday cost 1 penny a glass, would you turn it down? Drop your honest answer in the comments. In London in 1751, almost no one was turning it down. In St. Giles, almost no one could. In February of that year, 4 months before Parliament passed the Gin Act, a 53-year-old engraver named William Hogarth published a single sheet of paper that would do more to end the gin craze than any law ever did. It was called Gin Lane. The image is set in St. Giles, Mary Hatton's parish. The print was sold deliberately cheap because Hogarth wanted it everywhere. It worked. In the center of the image is a woman seated on the stone steps of a gin cellar. She is half naked, her legs covered in syphilitic sores, taking snuff. The baby in her lap is sliding out of her arms, falling head first toward the cellar below. To her left, a skeletal balladeer collapses against the railing with an empty bottle and a printed sheet titled "The Downfall of MDM Gin." Above him, a carpenter is pawning his saw at S. Gripes, Hogarth's joke about the pawnbroker who consumed every working man's tools. Behind that, a barber has hanged himself in his attic, the only tradesman in the print who could not survive the craze. On the cobbles below, a starving dog and a starving man fight over the same bone. The distillery on the corner has a name painted on it, Kilman, in other words, Killman. The church on the horizon is St. George's, Bloomsbury, Hogarth's deliberate signal that this is not allegory. This is a specific London street. Hogarth issued Gin Lane with a companion print called Beer Street, fat, happy, employed Englishmen drinking good English ale. The pawnbroker's window is empty. The carpenter has his saw. No one is dying. The message was unmistakable. Beer is patriotism. Gin is treason. Within 4 months, Parliament passed the Sale of Spirits Act. The dropped baby in Hogarth's print was not invented. 17 years before Gin Lane, a woman named Judith Defour walked into the workhouse at Bethnal Green to collect her 2-year-old daughter for the day. Her name was Mary. That was 27 January 1734. Mary Defour had been clothed by the parish, a fresh petticoat, a coat, stockings, shoes. Workhouse charity issued to a child whose mother could not afford to dress her. Judith Defour was a silk thrower, about 30 years old, single mother, recovering from a fever. She had a friend with her that afternoon, a woman known in court records only as Suki. They did not take Mary home. They walked her into a field outside the parish boundary, into a ditch on the road to Bethnal Green, and they stripped her naked. The petticoat, the coat, the stockings, the shoes, everything. Then Judith Defour put a handkerchief around the child's neck and pulled. According to the Ordinary of Newgate, who later took down Judith's confession, the child looked at her mother as she was being stripped, smiled at the same time in the mother's face, and called out, "Mammy," for she could speak no more, having neither come to the use of her tongue nor of her feet. Then the handkerchief. When Defour returned later, because she had been told Mary was still breathing, she struck the child on the head with a stone or brick to, in her own words, give the finishing stroke. The clothes sold for 1 shilling and 4pence. Every penny of it was spent on a single quart of gin. Judith Defour was hanged at Tyburn on 8th of March 1734. The Newgate Calendar later listed her case among the most shocking crimes of the century. The dropped baby on Hogarth's stone steps was Mary Defour. And the magistrate who had read every case like Mary Defour's was about to write the law that ended the gin craze. By January of 1751, the man at the centre of London's criminal justice system had spent 4 years reading every gin case the city produced. His name was Henry Fielding. He was 43 years old. He had written Tom Jones in 1749. The novel had made him famous. It had not made him rich. To pay his bills, Fielding had taken an unloved job, magistrate of the New Bow Street Court, the first organised magistrate's office in modern London. From his desk on Bow Street, he saw the same cases repeat. A woman in St. Giles starving her child for gin money, a journeyman pawning his tools and dying in a doorway, a husband strangling a wife over a 6pence. In January of 1751, a month before Hogarth printed Gin Lane, Fielding published a small book called An Inquiry into the Causes of the Late Increase of Robbers. He wrote it in the voice of a magistrate who had stopped pretending the problem was personal. He called gin the principal sustenance, if it may be so called, of more than 100,000 people in this metropolis. He called it a diabolical liquor. He warned that London was one bad harvest away from a winter the city would not survive, that the gin-soaked poor were turning into a permanent criminal class because the British state had given them no other way to keep warm, and he proposed the law that would end it. The license fee on distillers must be raised to a level that small backroom operators could not pay. The retail trade must be restricted to substantial property holders. The supply chain must be broken at the wholesaler. Distillers forbidden from selling to anyone unlicensed. 5 months later, Parliament passed exactly that. Henry Fielding had not just diagnosed the gin craze, he had written the law that ended it. In 1738, in a back alley of St. Luke's parish, a discharged army captain named Dudley Bradstreet decided to test how serious Parliament really was about the Gin Acts. The 1736 Gin Act had been the most aggressive yet. A licence fee of £50 a year was imposed on anyone selling spirits, an impossible sum for a cellar shop. It triggered riots in Spitalfields. Informers were beaten in the street. Within 18 months, the trade had gone underground. Bradstreet's contribution was elegant. He rented a room in Blue Anchor Alley. He nailed a wooden sign, shaped like a cat, to the inside of his ground floor window. Under one paw, he ran a lead pipe out through the wall, fitted with a wooden funnel. A customer would come to the window, look at the cat, and say the password, "Puss, give me 2 pennyworth of gin." They would then drop a coin into a slot in the cat's mouth. Bradstreet, invisible inside the room, would unstop the pipe and pour gin down it into whatever cup or hand the customer had ready outside. In his memoirs, written 20 years later, Bradstreet recorded the result. Before night, I took 6 shillings. The next day, above 30 shillings. It was the first vending machine in English history. It was invented in 1738. It was invented to evade gin prohibition. The 1743 Act lowered the license fee and made enforcement gentler. It failed. The 1747 Act loosened the rules. The trade grew. The 1751 Act broke the chain at the source. Distillers were forbidden by name from selling to any unlicensed retailer. The cellar shops dried up because there was no longer any gin to sell. In 1 year, London's gin production fell from over 7 million gallons to under 2. The cellar on Mary Hatton Street closed in October 1752. The gin craze was over. So why wouldn't you survive Georgian London in 1751? 4 reasons. You don't recognize what you're drinking. Every cheap drink in the modern world is regulated by chemistry. The gin in Mary Hatton's cup was unregulated grain spirit, cut with turpentine and sulfuric acid. You would not have known. The methanol would have begun working on your optic nerves within months. The vitriol would have begun dissolving your stomach lining within weeks. You have no way out of addiction. Mary Hatton has no Alcoholics Anonymous, no methadone clinic, no rehab, no employer-funded counseling, no SRI, no support group. The only thing that interrupts gin addiction in 1751 London is starvation, suicide, or the cellar closing. You live in a society where the children of poor mothers are nobody's problem. Mary Defour walked her 2-year-old to a ditch on the road to Bethnal Green in 1734, and no agency on earth was watching for her. The first child protection inspector in English history would not be hired for another century and a half. And you cannot drink the water. The Thames at London Bridge in 1751 was a tidal flow of raw sewage from a city of 700,000. Public pumps drew from contaminated wells. Gin, even adulterated gin, was rationally the safer drink. It was the safer drink. That was the trap the British state had built and was just now learning how to demolish. When the 1751 Act passed, London's gin production fell from over 7 million gallons that year to under 2 million the next. The trade did not vanish, but the open cellar shops did. The penny tariff died on the door of Mary Hatton's street. 3 centuries later, another government is watching another cheap drug, a synthetic, lethal, addictive substance manufactured for a fraction of the cost of what it replaces, sweep through its own pore. History will not repeat, but it will rhyme. Parliament built the cellar killed the city. If you want to know which other historical traps were built the same way, every video on this channel is one of the answers. Subscribe. The next one drops soon.